This is night number 3 in this new study called Tug of War, Tensions in the Biblical Text. So we laid the groundwork a couple weeks back, and then last week we were taking a look at origins as recorded in the book of Genesis. And tonight what we're going to do is, in lesson number 3, we want to talk a little bit about divine violence. So one of the things that happens very quickly in the Bible is the issue of violence comes up, and it is initiated by God. And in the book of Genesis, what we see taking place is it doesn't take but a few chapters before we are introduced to the flood narrative. So I want to remind you of a couple of slides that is always good to keep in the back of our mind as we move ahead. 3 things to keep in mind about the scriptures. They're ancient, which means we are dealing with a distant and foreign world. Often they're ambiguous. The Bible doesn't always lay out for us what to do or to think, and we can't kind of look things up and follow it like it's a recipe book. We have to apply wisdom and wrestle with what we are reading. And then thirdly, it's diverse. When you look up different subjects in the Bible, it doesn't speak in one voice. It speaks in a multiple of different angles. And we need to keep that in mind. And we shouldn't be surprised by it because of the various authors writing at different times and places and so forth. Then the other thing that we said at the very beginning was to read the Bible is not the same as the discipline of theology. Biblical studies and theology are 2 different things. Biblical study is looking at the Bible backwards, looking into the text, trying to consider the context and circumstances, whereas theology is taking that information and trying to move it into our present day and try to figure out what it means, both for a theological purpose, but many times for a practical purpose as well. So keep those couple of slides in the back of your mind as we move into the next tension point of the scripture, and that is divine violence. Now, it's interesting to me, many times since 9/11, we have categorized Islam as being a violent religion because the extremists had led an attack against the World Trade Center. And it's interesting that we haven't let go of that categorization of Islam, but we often ignore our own history and our own biblical text at the same time. When you look into the Old Testament, one of the things that you will find is that the Old Testament is a violent world. And we lift up both Old and New Testament to be given to us by God, that it is something that we turn to and we trust for accurate information about what God is doing or what God is thinking, that type of thing. But when you come into this subject matter about divine violence, you scratch your head a little bit in terms of why is God doing that? Why does God think that? And so when we point the finger at other world religions saying that they are a violent religion, we are turning a blind eye to our own. Often Christians just want to move into the New Testament rather quickly, but there are those that have challenged us, in particular the new atheists that have written within the last 20 years saying, yeah, you can't ignore this. This is in your text. You look to the Bible as kind of like a binding document for your life. What do you do with this information? So we are bipolar in some ways as Christians. We have an Old Testament text that looks much like many other violent elements of extremist religion. And then at the same time, we turn to the New Testament and we hear the words and teachings and life of Jesus. And we see him blessing those who are peacemakers and commending those of us who want to follow him to love our enemies and to pray for our enemies and so forth. So this is a topic that kind of causes us to sit on a fence. What do we do with one side of the text? What do we do with the other side of the text? And how do we reconcile those things? Now, I don't know if you've ever paid attention, close attention, to the Old Testament when you are reading, and some of the things that pop up. They are actually very eye-opening and mind-bending. So let me give you 10 examples. We're not going to look at all 10. We're going to look at 3 tonight, but I want to summarize here. One of them that we will look at is in a few chapters from the creation narrative. We see that God drowns all life on earth except a core few people being a part of Noah's family. That's in Genesis 6. Into the book of Exodus, what we find is that Moses goes up to receive the law. Meanwhile, down below, Aaron fashions a golden calf, and the people worship the golden calf because they need something tangible to worship, and they don't know what happened to Moses. Moses comes back down, he breaks the tablets, but then what happens is God, it says in chapter 32 of Exodus, is going to kill everybody. And Moses intercedes, and so God relents on that and will not execute all the people. Then Moses tells the tribe of Levi, you can read all this in chapter 32 of Exodus, to go through the camp and to kill 3,000 of the people who had been unfaithful to the covenant. And God seems very pleased that Moses commanded that and accomplished it. Number 3, during their 40-year desert wandering, the Israelites are commanded by God to avenge themselves of the Midianites that they had skirmishes with. And you can read in chapter 31 of Numbers that they go through and they kill everyone under by the command of God. And the only people that are allowed to live are virgin females that the men get to divide up among themselves as spoils of war. Number 4, God commands the Israelites to enslave or kill the residents of towns along the way to the promised land. And there we will take a quick look at this. So we'll take a look at number 1 and number 4 tonight. Now, what happens as they go through, they are told to kill every breathing thing except the trees. Don't cut down the trees. The trees are more important than the people. Interesting. Number 5, the list of curses in the book of Deuteronomy shows that those who disobey God will experience all kinds of different pestilence, panic, consumption, that type of thing. Very, very poignant list of things that will come upon the people. Number 6, while exterminating the Canaanites at God's command, Joshua tracks down 5 kings in chapter 10 of Joshua, kills them, and then impales them on trees. Again, all of this is seems to be at God's command. Number 7, as punishment for an earlier incident in Exodus chapter 17, King Saul is going to wage war against the Amalekites, and then he kills their king, Agag, and then 1 Samuel 15 says that every man, woman, and child and the livestock are killed as well. So you begin to see a pattern here. Number 8, as a punishment for false worship, God brings the Babylonians to slaughter the Judites in the streets. Jeremiah 7 and 19 tells us that they are to leave their bodies in the open fields for as food for birds, and they are to reduce the survivors as well by not providing any food, which then turns to cannibalism as people begin to eat their children and their neighbors. All of this is in the holy text. Number 9, some writers ask God to slay their enemies, including dashing Babylonian little children against the rocks in Psalm 137, verse 9. And finally, number 10, in the book of Job, God allows a member of his heavenly court called the Ha-Satan, or Satan, the adversary, to kill Job's children, his livestock, and inflict him with incredible pain as sort of a faith test and fidelity to God. So you can see these are just 10 examples, and there's a lot more than that. Just read the book of Judges. Oh my gosh, there's all kinds of things in the book of Judges. So what do we do with this very violent world that seems to be this way, not because it's just the times, but God is commanding it. God is the one that is prompting it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at 3 of these 10, and we're going to try to struggle with what I'm calling sadistic sovereignty. When we struggle with the violence of God, it is something that is not new for people of faith. I mean, when religions turn violent, the question becomes, is that what God is like too? Is God like that? And so these biblical stories don't mince words. They don't try to hide it in any way. It's right out in the front for us to see if we read the text. Now, the Israelites did not make up this idea of divine violence. Even in older cultures than the Israelites, violence is kind of woven not only into the fabric of their religion, but even into the fabric of how the world was created. So this is where the biblical text does differ from older creation stories. The older creation stories say that the cosmos was created after a cosmic battle between the gods. And the gods in their battle often cut each other, and one split open and created the earth. I mean, very mythological type of explanations, but it's the idea that creation came about because of violence, not because God was pleased to create. So these older stories, while it doesn't make it into the book of Genesis, it does not take long in the text, though, of Genesis for this mentality that God is associated with violence to appear. And that's what we find when we get in to the book of Genesis. It is very quickly in the book of Genesis, this subject matter comes up. So, in general, where do we start? Now, I think without understanding how the Old Testament cultural influences play into this, I think we could conclude that if we take this only at face value, that like the early church father Marcion said, it's not the same God that we're talking about in the New Testament. These are 2 completely different gods. Many think that the death of Jesus brings an end to the violent side of God. That's what the crucifixion is all about. God is violent, but God demands one last act of violence, and then all of a sudden, he's a loving God, and he is full of grace and mercy to people. That's one way of looking at the cross. It's a very retributive type of understanding of the cross, that God is mad and God is angry and God is violent. And the only way that that can be turned away is through the sacrifice of Jesus. Now, here's the tension point. Within the same book, Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 17, God commands, you shall not kill. And of course, that's part of the Ten Commandments. Only a few chapters later, in chapter 20, verses 16 and 17, it tells us that from the cities that they are going to receive as an inheritance, they are not to spare anything that breathes. So if God is commanding not to kill, he has violated his own commandment by telling people to kill everything that breathes. Are you getting a feel for the tug of war here, the tension point? So what do we do with it? Well, here's what I'd like to do. Ask the question, does God command and condone such behavior? Or is there another explanation for it? So this quest of trying to come to terms with this subject is sort of like what a physicist is trying to do when trying to integrate all the known phenomena of the physical universe. It's almost an impossible task. But yet the quest for some type of framework that can take into account all of these aspects, while daunting, is yet something that is noteworthy and something that I think is worth pursuing. So when we put this into context with the rise of violent religious extremism, and I will say that we're seeing that with the rise of white Christian nationalism as well within our own tradition, then what we find is the cross of Jesus is not remedying the problem. Sometimes this idea of Jesus himself being kind of a warlord, and we're gonna take back what we lost, or we're going to conquer, that type of thing, creeps into even the theological circles of various Christian movements as well. So it's not just something in the past, it's something that is also right in front of us as well. So here's what we want to do. Let's pick apart three stories. And I'm going to then conclude with some final explanations, okay? So, number one, if you have a Bible and if you want to glance at this, but I'll give you a heads up right away. Genesis chapter 6, while it's the flood story, the entire, excuse me, the entire context of it moves beyond chapter 6. So it's quite a bit of text that we're looking at here. So in Genesis chapter 6, it starts off kind of strange, all right? In Genesis chapter 6, what we're told is after there's a genealogy in chapter 5, it begins by saying when human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. So there's this strange story that's introduced. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then it says in verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of men went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, and they were the heroes of old, men of renown. But then in verse 5, we're given the reason for the coming flood. It says, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. So we know that story. And that story is quite shocking if you think about God saying, and it is good, and it is good, and it is good in chapter 1. He creates this, he creates that, and it is good. And he creates mankind, and it is very good. And then, only a few chapters later, he wants to wipe them all out. Now, the key question here is, what is the heart of this story? Well, for Sunday school kids, the heart of the story is God saves all these people and takes animals onto the ark 2 by 2. And so let's make a crib room to look like Noah's Ark and all the animals. Well, that's cute, but this is not a children's story, not by any means. The ark is not the heart of the story. The violence of humanity that prompts violence from God is the heart of the story here. And why would God, here's the challenge, why would God condemn mankind for violence and then turn to violence to remedy the very thing he's condemning them for? You see the theological tension point there. So God seems to be taken by surprise a little bit. He sees this happening, and it's kind of reflected in the statement, "Oh man, I regret creating them. What was I thinking?" That type of thing. It's almost like he's taken by surprise. Now, I think you probably know that this is not the earliest nor the only flood story. There are other flood stories, and there is some type of historical hook that's behind all of these flood stories from different cultures. So something happened. Is it a worldwide flood? I don't think so, but I think it's something significant enough that it became part of the tradition and folklore of the various people that lived through it and saw the tragedy. So maybe what we're thinking about here, and remember, after I finish the video and stop the recording, we'll open it up and dialogue back and forth if you have questions. There are many different flood stories, and the oldest one is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it is trying to do what I think all the people of that day is trying to do. There's this conundrum. And the conundrum is this. There's this local deluge of something that happened in Mesopotamia, and it caused a lot of damage and loss of life possibly as well. The key question, though, is, since everything is attributed to divine cause and effect in the ancient world, what did we do to deserve this? Why are the gods mad at us that they would send this flood? I think that the biblical story of the flood is trying to do what every other flood story that is from that ancient era is trying to do, is trying to figure out a reason for it. Now, that is something that human beings have never given up on. We know that when tragedy strikes, the first impulse that we have is, why did God allow this? What did I do wrong? I don't care if it's a tsunami, an earthquake, a tornado, or hurricane, a wildfire. That just seems to be the natural response of human beings. What did we do wrong? That begins early in the historical narrative. And that's what we find taking place in Genesis. And I think what is happening in Genesis is an attempt that is more realistic than what we find in other ancient explanations. In other words, God didn't send this because human beings were being too loud and he wants to shut them up. The biblical text is recognizing from the days of Cain and Abel that there is violence in the world, and it's a problem. And it is beginning to rise into a worldwide influence because we know the ancient world, the ancient Near East, is a very, very violent world. You see it just by what people do to each other in some of these stories. So I think what's happening is in the text, there is an attempt to explain why this historical event, whatever it is, took place. And it does what the rest of the culture is doing, attributing it to God. So when we look at it, the account of the deluge is basically saying that the cause had to be something so severe that it made God so very angry that he wanted to wipe the human race out. But it's interesting the way they introduce this story. And it's found in the commingling between the daughters of men and the sons of God. Now, you possibly have heard one explanation of this is that this is part of the supernatural realm that left their domain. They cohabited with women, and their offspring is described as the heroes of old and men of renown. In other words, there's this mythical legendary story that there's an encroachment of the divine realm into the human realm, and that's why God had to send the flood, is to destroy the potential of this mixing of these two very distinct categories of life. My take, and you don't have to agree with this at all, it's very unlikely God had anything to do with the flood. It is an ancient way of trying to explain something they had no way of explaining. They did not know how weather works the way we do. They didn't have Doppler radar. They didn't know hours in advance that a tornado watch or hurricane watch needs to be made because it's going to do a lot of damage. The Israelites themselves believed that it had something to do with the divine. I I think that whatever this historical hook is, there is a flood that brings about a lot of damage and death, and they're trying to explain the only way they know how, why did God do this? How is it that God allowed this? And so their explanation then um, turns into this story about Noah and the flood, and it goes on into chapter 7 and chapter 8, and it's quite lengthy as it details the waters and how it rises and how Noah sends out through a window a raven and a dove, and they don't come back, and finally one does come back with a twig in its mouth, and so the waters recede. Um, this is possibly a way of explaining how they got through it, and then the covenant that God makes with Noah in chapter 9 with the rainbow, and then the sons of Noah continue with the genealogy in chapter 9. And we'll keep that Bible text open to chapter 9 of Genesis because that's where the Canaanites are introduced. But more about that in a moment. So, these things I think are struggles for all of us to figure out, is this what God is really like? Would God really command this? Or is this what the people at the time thought God was demanding of them? Okay, so that's the hard part of this tug of war in the scriptural text, because you get to the New Testament And Jesus is going, Abba, Father. God is like the father in the parable of the prodigal son, and on and on and on it goes. So there's kind of this schizophrenia, there's this bipolar nature between the Old and New Testament, and those tensions are there. And I think one way is to understand the diversity, ambiguity, and the ancientness of these texts and what they did for their own day and possibly what they do in our day sometimes lead us down a wrong trail. Okay. All right. Number two. So the curses and punishments that are found in the book of Deuteronomy are quite daunting. Um, Most specifically, in chapter 28, you have this listing of curses that is basically describing for us blessings for obedience and consequences for disobedience. So when you get to chapter 28, verse 15, I mean, you look at that chapter and I'll just read parts of it. It just says, um, it says here, if you disobey, verse 15, the Lord your God, and do not follow all his commands and decrees I'm giving to you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. And it talks a lot about some things here. I'll jump down to verse 21. The Lord will plague you with diseases until he has destroyed you from the land you are entering to possess. The Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever and inflammation, with scorching heat and drought, with blight and mildew, which will plague you until you perish. The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you iron. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust, so famine will occur, that type of thing. And you just read one after another, after another, after another. You jump down to verse 38, it says, you will sow much seed in the field, but you will harvest little because the locusts will devour it. It's almost as if we're rehearsing some of the plagues from Exodus. You'll plant vineyards and cultivate them, but you're not going to drink their wine, so on and so forth. And it goes all that, it keeps going on that way into chapter 29. So, I mean, if you really want to stay up at night, this could spook you into insomnia. Okay. Um, so what do we do with that? There's a lot of violence in there. Is that from God? So one thing to keep in mind about this tension point is the literary context of Deuteronomy is quite late. The final product of the book of Deuteronomy is not until the Babylonian exile. So the people are looking back, and I know a lot of times we think the second giving of the law is for the new generation that's going to go into the land, and that's the way it's written. But it's the final edition of it is not complete until the actual exile. Deuteronomy is not so much a prediction, but the final editors are putting together a horrific list of what God will do if you continue to be unfaithful to the covenant. He's already sent us into exile. And this is trying to scare them into obedience. So televangelists aren't the first to try to use fear to manipulate people. This, in some ways, is very manipulative. You don't see any forgiveness in the text here. It reads like an over-the-top parent who is out of control, who has lost it. Last week, one of the brand new drafted Cleveland Browns will probably not see the field this year because he got all out of control with his girlfriend. And, you know, he was threatening to kill her and all this type of thing. So the behavior seems to be that of someone that takes no resistance. If you resist, if you object, I'm going to put you down. So in this, with this cultural understanding that, again, in a violent world, that's what gods do. We look at some of these curses here in the book of Deuteronomy, and possibly what is happening, since it's a document that has been in development for many years. Some scholars think that in the 7th century, the Assyrians had already taken the northern tribes captive, but the southern tribes have not been taken captive quite yet into Babylon. The structure of the book of Deuteronomy looks just like an Assyrian suzerain vassal treaty. Now, what I mean by that is the king sets up a treaty, and he's the suzerain, he's the protector, he's the overlord, he's the one that will care for the people and fight for the people, unless the vassal disobeys him or tries to make an alliance with somebody else. And if that happens, they list out a bunch of curses that are going to come down upon those people. The book of Deuteronomy looks very similar to the ancient Assyrian treaties, where the king is giving both a promise and a threat, and he is saying, if you obey me, I will protect you. If you disobey me, I will wipe you out. And that reflection is something that is found in the book of Deuteronomy, because God is the king. It's not an earthly king. Now God is the king, because God led them out of Egypt and toward the promised land. So it might be that the book of Deuteronomy is not so much an actual description of what has happened to these people, but the fear of what could happen to them if they don't obey the covenant. So you see a word down here called theopolitical statement. More than a theological statement, this is a theopolitical statement, because God is the king in the eyes of those who have been taken into exile. And here's a political statement: stay faithful to this king. If you don't, then all kinds of things are going to happen, everything from disease to death. All right. Number 3. So I told you back in Genesis chapter 9, if you kind of kept your finger there, we are introduced to the sons of Noah. And these sons of Noah, one of them's named Canaan. Okay, so I'll read this, and then we'll come to the Canaanite genocide. So in verse 18, it says, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. So there's that one is singled out. These were the 3 sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, so there's the second mention, saw his father naked and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders, then walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, okay, boy, there's a lot to read into that verse. What did the youngest son? We're already told here that 2 of the boys tried to honor their father, and it was Shem and Japheth. They covered their father's nakedness. But this other one, when Noah woke from his wine and found out what the youngest son had done to him, he pronounces a curse. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be a slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. So 5 times in that paragraph, the name Canaan is mentioned. Obviously, from Canaan came the what? Canaanites, all right? So there's an ugly beginning to this account of the Canaanites. Fast forward to the book of Numbers, and we're told of the story of after the Exodus, Israel goes to Mount Sinai, they receive the law, they send 12 spies in to do reconnaissance work in the land to see what they're up to, what they're going to face when they try to take the promised land. So the 12 spies come back, 10 say no, and only 2 say go. And the 10 convince the rest of the population. They turn around and they go back into the wilderness, and it's there that they will wander for a prolonged period of time. Now, even that is, in a sense, an act of violence, because even though it's not an instantaneous act of violence, it's a prolonged death. God says they're not going into the land. So they're all going to die in the desert. So this new generation now is going to take on the task of entering the land. And as they enter into the land, they are told by God in the book of Joshua to eradicate all their enemies. And not only that, but everything that breathes. So they're going to face some fortified cities like Jericho that will require some divine intervention. So that story in Joshua where they march around Jericho and blow the trumpets and the walls come down becomes part of this assistance from God in taking the land. But in Deuteronomy chapter 20, there's a listing of 2 types of towns. This is fascinating. The first kind of town is on the outskirts. And God tells the people to go and offer them a treaty of peace. If they accept it, great. Allow them to live. However, they will be subject to enslavement. Okay? If they refuse the terms of peace, kill all the men. But the rest of the population is saved. Okay? They're enslaved, but they're alive. Then when you get to some of these fortified type cities, not on the outskirts, but Jericho and other places like that, this second type of town is where the Israelites are to go in and they're just told to kill everything that breathes, destroy it. And the only thing that is to survive, and you can read this in Deuteronomy 20, are the trees that provide food. Don't cut them down, okay? So that becomes what is known as the Canaanite genocide, okay? That they're going to go in and wipe everybody out. How do we explain this? If it is something that happened the way it's stated in the text, it's genocide, pure and simple. Let's wipe out the Canaanites. And it seems that the Canaanites have a long history of being tagged as the evil people that are not worthy to live, sort of like the Palestinians are right now. Kill them all. And, you know, this is something that has turned many people away from the faith. I cannot believe in a God that would command a genocide like this. So one thing to keep in mind about this is culturally, this is how people talked about their enemies in the tribal world. They're not they are scapegoated. They are considered the scum of the earth. And the best way to move on with life is to eradicate them. Now, it is also in a tribal culture a way of telling the story of a defeat of an enemy. Okay. So the fact is that there's a lot of exaggeration at times in the Bible, and it's done for political purposes. If we tell the story that all the Canaanites have been wiped out because God is on our side, then they're not going to, other people are not going to try to go to war with them. See what happened? All these Canaanites were destroyed. So there's some political angles that are going on here. It is most likely that God never commanded the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites, but the Israelites believed God wanted them to do that. So let's think about mass murderers who hear voices that says, hey, God told me to do this. Now, nowadays we go, the guy's nuts, right? Why, why would they hear a voice in their head to say, do this? Those that are outside the faith will look at this and say, why would God whisper in the ears to destroy the Canaanites, to destroy all of them? Especially when you get the tension point in the New Testament when Jesus reaches out to a Canaanite woman and commends her faith. And so it's interesting how this is working out. The ancient Near East naturally connects their warlike desires to God. So we all do this. We always think of God within our own cultural context. In other words, we always talk of God from the bottom up, not the top down. We always talk about God from where we are and what we have experienced. I think that's what's going on here as well. They're talking about God from the bottom up in a warring culture that uses propaganda, if I can use that word, to advance their cause in war, that type of thing. Then what you'll find is then it gets attached to God sometimes. God told us to do this. So, is this cultural propaganda? I think there are some elements of it. I really do. And here's why. When you take what happens here in Joshua and the entrance into the land, if there was as many wars that were going on in the taking of the land, there would be all kinds of evidence of that archaeologically. There's very little evidence of that by archaeologists. So archaeologists, biblical archaeologists, suggest that while there are skirmishes and battles with Canaanites, that's the historical hook. There is little support for a complete Canaanite genocide. In fact, some survive. I mean, you have a Canaanite woman in the New Testament that Jesus is talking about. Most of the towns that are destroyed in the book of Joshua archaeologically show no signs of destruction. And sometimes even some of them weren't even occupied according to the timeline. So this idea of a mass extermination in Canaan is a bit exaggerated. Is there a historical hook? Yes. Just like the flood is a historical hook. But it seems to be pumped up. And the reason it's pumped up is for their own purposes of showing that God has chosen us. We're his chosen people. He's on our side. And see what happened to the Canaanites? That could happen to you as well. The only problem is they were defeated successively from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to Rome. They were a conquered people through all those empires. So this is a way of telling a story through their own imagination, their own mindset, and their desire to control the narrative. So think of when you were growing up and you went out to recess. And back then, there were all kinds of phrases that were used. Your mother wears combat boots. Well, little did we know all these years later, mothers really do wear combat boots at times with skirts and other things. But there is this playground mentality, and there's this playground jargon that is often used. Even Trump tried to use that playground jargon when he was talking in the trailer about grabbing the you know what of women. Okay, that's how he tried to explain it. This is just locker room talk. But while there is some element of truth in schoolyard tales, these kids look through a particular lens and talk about my dad being better than your dad, that type of thing. Yet at the same time, it's exaggerated, and it's to show that I'm better than you are. And these stories are very important to the life and history of the nation of Israel. It's what allows them to survive, and it's what allows them to continue to survive through some very, very difficult circumstances historically. And here's what often happens when you put playground talk on steroids and it becomes national and international. This is where the doctrine of exceptionalism often originates. Our nation is the best in the world. That just sends chills up my spine, because I want to say we're great at a lot of things, but we're not the best at everything. There's different nations that do different things a lot better than we do. And we do things that are a lot better than other nations and other things. But the doctrine of exceptionalism is what fuels zealous extremism a lot of times. And we have to be careful of that. So I see seeds of that happening in the Canaanite text here. So, okay, I'm going to close this off with 5 different ways you can deal with this. So we know the tug of war, we know of the tension. What do we do with it? And you can do one of these 5, or you can do a mix of these 5. Number 1, you can say, hey, God's sovereign. He can do whatever he wants. If he wants to command the Israelites to kill everybody to get into the promised land, that's up to him. The explanation is part of the problem, though. Why would God do this? Can you trust that God? Or is it counterintuitive to think of a God who says that he's love, that he would do that? Secondly, there are people that will say, and they just want to get away from the topic and not think about it. Well, God's ways are mysterious. We don't know. Well, I agree. God's ways are mysterious, obviously, but that's true on all levels of life. But when you apply it here, God's ways aren't mysterious in this situation. He gives reasons about why he does some things, because these people are corrupt. It's because of their sexual practices. It's because they'll lead you to worship other gods. It's not like it's a real mystery. It's stated that the reason God is telling them to do this is because of these type of potential consequences. Number 3, well, the Canaanites deserved it. They were the most evil people on the face of the earth. They had deviant practices like child sacrifice, that type of thing. But it seems to me there's a historical connection all the way back to the time of Noah. It's more than just these people and their current behavior. It almost seems as if from the get-go, the Canaanites are kind of singled out as the scapegoats of all the problems in the world. That's what human beings do as well. They pick a group of people that are the problem of the whole world, and the best way to get rid of it is to get rid of them. So maybe what's happening here is um, the Canaanites do kind of stand in the way of the full possession of the land, but it's very probable that the Canaanites are probably pretty similar to the rest of the ancient Near East and the tribal culture that is there. There may be a vested interest in portraying them as especially evil in this text here because they're the scapegoats that begins in Genesis 9 and moves forward. Number 4. Well, God's not always like that. Yeah, God has a violent side, and occasionally, God's anger and wrath will cause these things to happen and so forth. And but it's kind of interesting that we would not accept that as a character description of anybody else. Let's go back to our playground illustration. So there's a bully on the playground, and he beats kids up twice a week on the playground. But the teacher says, oh, little Billy, I know he's a bully on Tuesday and Thursdays, but the rest of the week, he's a good person. None of us would accept that. Say, no, this kid's got a problem. Does the fact that he doesn't beat kids up the other 5 days of the week make him a good bully? Okay, I'm just trying to feed your thinking here a little bit. Here's number 5, and this is the one that I think is probably closer to understanding this tension point. Number 1, the ancient Near East is a violent world, and there's a mentality that comes with that, and it's usually associated with violence. God naturally is presented within the culture of the day because our understanding of God is always from the ground up. The Israelites seem to be understanding God to act in particular ways based on their expectation or at least hope of what they want God to do for them. So we cannot put aside our own prejudice and our own desire to manipulate God into our own image. There's an old saying that goes like this: we are created in the image of God, and then we return the favor by creating God in our image. So that seems to come at various points. So this is a tough topic, and it's not something that is easily understood. The technical term for it is called theodicy. Why does God allow evil? Why does God cause evil? That type of thing. Will not fully answer it. Theologians have been trying to do it for years. But hopefully you can begin to say, okay, there are some other things that are going on here, and this might help a little bit. So that's where I'm going to conclude my content for tonight, and we'll stop the share at this point, and we'll stop the recording, and then we'll have some discussion together, okay? Hold on.